Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 14th chapter. Lost in lamentable reflections, the inspector did not notice how the car stopped moving. "Good sir, we are already there," the driver said cheerfully. Galbraith turned away from his mirthless thoughts and looked out the window. Outside was a snow-covered field that stretched to the horizon. Here and there sparse trees stuck out between the snowdrifts. "Are we sure we've arrived at the right address?" the policeman asked incredulously. "Do you think I decided to fool you?" the taxi driver said with offense. The inspector decided not to get into an altercation with him and opened the door. There was no bitter blizzard, but rare snowflakes continued to hover in the air. It would be crazy to go out in such light clothes, but Galbraith didn't care anymore. Getting out of the car, he took 2 steps forward and breathed in the fresh air. A gust of cold wind blew through his hair. "I said, take me to the institute," he shouted, looking around. "And what's this?" "A barn," answered the taxi driver from the window. The car started moving and sped off into the distance. Shivering from the cold, the inspector took his eyes off the road and turned on his heel. He expected to see a typical building of an ordinary institute, a huge 4-story structure with long rows of windows, with a colonnade at the main facade and with mysterious Latin inscriptions above the main entrance. But instead, he saw a modest 1-story house. Although, to be honest, calling it house would be an exaggeration. The structure looked much more like a car garage, built from cinder blocks finished with dark blue plaster. Galbraith looked a little more closely. The building had the shape of a parallelepiped, with 4 windows along the long sides. At the end there was a double wooden door with small windows made of thick glass. This, in fact, was where all the architectural delights ended, no signs, inscriptions, or plaques. It looked like it really was an ordinary, unremarkable garage. But the inspector decided not to rush to conclusions and came close to the entrance. As soon as he pulled the copper handle, a light came on behind the glass of the doors. Then something tinkled behind them and there was a quiet click. Galbraith immediately let go of the handle and backed away slightly. The next moment the door slowly opened. A young man stood on the threshold in a white coat thrown over a black shirt. The policeman looked up. The stranger had a yellowish skin tone, small thin lips and combed-back black hair. The Asian man looked at the inspector, and polite curiosity was visible in his narrow, slanted eyes. At the first moment, Galbraith even had the thought that he had already seen this face somewhere, maybe in a movie, but he immediately pushed this thought away. "Welcome," the Asian said respectfully and bowed his head slightly. The inspector couldn't help but notice that the interlocutor had problems pronouncing the letter L. Instead he got an R, which is why his welcome sounded almost like Varicombe. "I am glad that you honored our Humbre Institute with your visit," the stranger in the coat said obsequiously with a terrible accent. "Come in, they are waiting for you." The solemnity that was felt in the words of this Asian only emphasized the atmosphere of absurdity that surrounded Galbraith at that moment. Having crossed the threshold, the inspector followed his guide, not having the slightest idea where he was leading him. They walked through a narrow, short corridor and found themselves in a dressing room-like room, the walls of which were painted gray. Galbraith immediately caught the eye of the staircase leading down, located directly opposite the entrance to the room. To her right was the elevator door, next to which stood a metal clothes hanger on which hung several white coats, exactly the same as the one the Asian man who met him was wearing. Behind these clothes, Galbraith did not immediately notice a man standing at a distance in the same suit. Taking a closer look, the inspector recognized him as the same middle-aged guest who had visited him in his room at the State of Snow Lake Hotel in the morning. "Wow, here you are," there was a cheerful shout. The man waved his hand joyfully, and the policeman saw his face break into a smile for a moment. It seemed as if he saw an old friend whom he had not seen for many years. After a second, the smile disappeared from his face and the man turned his gaze to the Asian man standing next to the inspector and winked at him. He nodded in response and headed towards the stairs. Galbraith wanted to follow, but the silver-haired man stopped him. "Hold your horses, the respected, hold your horses," he said ingratiatingly, clapping his hands. "How can I be useful in this place?" Galbraith asked, looking with interest at the specialist. "I would like to say a few words to you." The interlocutor seemed to have not heard him. "I was already afraid that you wouldn't come." "Why?" The inspector didn't understand what Silver-haired was talking about. 2 months and 8 days have passed since I handed you the business card," the man answered, raising his finger up. Galbraith was a little surprised by the accuracy with which his interlocutor counted the time. Apparently, he never complained about his memory. Besides, people here were really looking forward to the inspector's visit. The more the policeman thought about it, the more a vague feeling of anxiety came over him. To drive him away, Galbraith decided to focus on the upcoming conversation. "Yes, I wasn't in much of a hurry," he answered evasively. Not telling this silver-haired man that he actually moved in time by getting into some taxi, not only did it sound stupid, but it could also suggest that the inspector was not all right in the head. Good, the specialist was satisfied with this answer. "Put it on." With these words, he took one of the white coats from the hanger and handed it to Galbraith. "What is this for?" asked the inspector, incredulously turning this item of clothing in his hands. "For hygienic reasons," the silver-haired man answered. "Huh, you're afraid I'll bring germs into your barn," Galbraith grinned, throwing this coat over his shoulders. The specialist seemed to be offended by such words from the guest. He twitched with his whole body and threw a look of reproach at Galbraith. "I understand that you are not very impressed by the facade of our institute, but do not rush to conclusions," he spoke hastily. "Where exactly is the institute itself?" Galbraith asked curiously. "Below," the specialist said solemnly. He pointed with his hand towards the stairs, on the upper steps of which stood an Asian man leaning against the wall. He seemed to be just waiting for this sign. He walked away from the wall and, as if about to bow, slightly bent his knees, but the next moment he straightened up and froze in place. "Mikoto-san believes that the closer a person is to the core of the earth, the more his mind is open to universal wisdom." At these words, a crazy light flashed in the Asian's eyes. "What nonsense did he say?" Galbraith asked the silver-haired man. "Forgive generously young Mr. Manabu for idolizing his teacher too much," the specialist said with embarrassment. "I don't care about the relationship between a student and his teacher," Galbraith remarked somewhat rudely. "Explain in a few words what is happening here." In the heat of his feelings, Manabu lost sight of the fact, the silver-haired man began, that Montesi decided to hide his developments from prying eyes. "Montesi? Mikoto? Who are all these people?" The inspector was already beginning to be annoyed by this old man and his Asian friend. "While we are on our way down, you and I will have enough time to bring you up to date." The specialist did not seem to notice the inspector's dissatisfaction. After these words, the specialist approached the stairs, and his Asian companion, now it turned out that he was Japanese, followed him. Galbraith silently looked after them and decided to go to the elevator. "No, no, no," the silver-haired man shouted to him. "Follow us." "Why don't we just take the elevator?" Galbraith asked, taking his hand away from the call button. "The fact is that the institute is located at such a great depth," the specialist began in the tone of an art critic in the museum, "that during an elevator ride your brain runs the risk of not being able to cope with the rapid change in pressure." "So what?" The inspector was not impressed by this abstruse excuse. "And in this case, you, my respected and impatient friend, will just lose consciousness right in the cabin," the silver-haired man said with obvious mockery. "Are you threatening me?" The policeman involuntarily became wary. "Threat is the weapon of cowards," pouting with importance, the Japanese intervened in the conversation. "Mikoto-san always said that a person is obliged." "I have no obligations to you too," Galbraith interrupted him. The inspector walked away from the elevator and stood next to his interlocutors. He had a view of a spiral staircase going deep into a round concrete shaft. The steps were illuminated by rare yellow diodes hanging on an aluminum wire stretched over the staircase railing. The end of this steel spiral was lost in the darkness, and not a single sound came from there. At the sight of this descent, a chill ran down the policeman's spine. In his entire adult life he had never seen such a great depth. Galbraith felt his hands involuntarily shaking, and with difficulty he restrained himself from succumbing to the impulse of fear and rushing to the exit from this place. He looked at the gray-haired man. He did not seem to experience any discomfort, calmly looking forward. Then the inspector turned to the Japanese. He looked at Galbraith with curiosity, and his eyes seemed to say, "Are you scared? This is a lesson for you not to be rude to scientists." "Well, let's go," the specialist said in a cheerful tone. With these words, he grabbed the iron railing with one hand and began to leisurely descend the stairs. The Japanese followed him. Galbraith was in no hurry to follow them and leaned his elbows on the railing. "Hey, wait a second," he said quietly after them. The silver-haired man did not seem to hear him and continued to walk, and only his yellow-faced companion did a favor for the guest and turned his head slightly back, looking strangely sideways at Galbraith. "Make me a promise that at the end of this excursion I will return back safe and sound, okay?" the inspector asked with unexpected gentleness. "Don't worry," came the specialist's voice. "You are our guest, and therefore we have no right to wish you harm in any case." The Japanese didn't say a word. He just beckoned the inspector with his finger and, turning away from him, continued on his way. Galbraith, who was saddened by these words, shrugged his shoulders and obediently followed them both. There was a slightly musty underground smell hanging in the air of the descent shaft, something between the smell of mustiness and fug. It is curious that the lower they descended, the warmer the air became. "Please don't stomp," the gray-haired man suddenly shouted. The inspector only now realized that all this time his companions had been walking silently along the metal steps, while he, in his loafers, was actually making a very distinct stomp. Galbraith looked at the heels of the Japanese man walking in front of him and could not help but smile. On the young man's bare feet there were rubber flip-flops, very similar to those worn by tourists sunbathing on the beach. This was so dissonant with the scientist's white coat that the inspector could not help but comment on it out loud. "Amusing dress code you have here," he said, trying to slow down his pace. "Are you talking about slippers?" asked the silver-haired man, continuing to go down. "We would have given them to you too, but we thought you would start complaining." "But why flip-flops?" Galbraith asked over the head of the silent Japanese. "The legs breathe, also the stomping does not interfere with the conversation," the specialist answered calmly. Galbraith finally mastered the fear that gripped him a couple of minutes ago. Now he found it funny, to such an extent that he was almost sure that all this was happening in some kind of comedy farce. "And what do you want to tell me, mister?" The inspector waited for the gray-haired man to identify himself. "Just call me the specialist," answered the silver-haired man. "What kind of conspiracy is this?" the inspector sensed a catch. "Our scientific people have no names," the specialist said mysteriously. "Henri, when an individual manages to achieve success, does he have every right to call himself?" suddenly spoke up a Japanese man, who had previously kept quiet. Galbraith frowned. "Wait, what about Manabu?" He remembered the name of the Asian. "Mr. Manabu has the reputation of being his teacher's first assistant," answered the specialist. "He is worthy to be addressed by name." "Does that mean you are not worthy?" the policeman marveled at this injustice. "I'm just an executant that no one will ever mention," the silver-haired man said sadly. Like a musician in an orchestra, listeners first talk about the composer, then about the conductor, and no one cares about who produces the sounds of music themselves. There was a grain of truth in the specialist's words. But this still seemed to Galbraith an insufficient excuse for the fact that the man who last morning, but in fact 2 months ago, paid a surprise visit to the inspector, continues to hide his name from the policeman. "How long do we have to go?" Galbraith asked the specialist. "It's better not to ask this question," he answered evasively. This means, the inspector thought, the institute is indeed located quite deep underground. Strange, very strange. Why hide so carefully from human eyes what relates to computer technology? Would you mind telling me then who this Montesi you mentioned is? The inspector asked the question again. Pourquoi pas? Exclaimed the silver-haired man in French. This is exactly what we have prepared for beginners. Curious. And how many people have you directed to the right path? The policeman said sarcastically. So far, not a single one. You are the first to receive such an honor. The Japanese raised his voice again. Walking behind his companions, Galbraith quickly realized why he was the first guest of this institute. Few people would want to go deep underground, inhaling the stale air and trying not to fall head over heels from the spiral staircase. The inspector had the feeling that he was descending into the Mariana Trench or, God forbid, to where took place the actions of Divine Comedy by Durante di Alighiero degli Alighieri. Montesi was an engineer-constructor. Meanwhile the specialist began, who, from his school days, cherished the idea of creating an eternal supercomputer. What? Galbraith asked, not believing his ears. Eternal in that sense, as if making a footnote, the silver-haired man said, that the integrated circuits that form the basis of the machine do not wear out over time. Of course, subject to operating conditions, the Japanese inserted moralizingly. Mr. Manabu is right, a supercomputer will not last a day if left in the rain, but who would come up with the idea of such an act of vandalism? The specialist agreed with the interlocutor. Well, yes, Galbraith said quietly. All in all, the silver-haired man continued the story. Montesi, as a student, moved from his native Chile to England, and in its capital he quickly found people interested in this. Do you want to say that in London there were some naive technology manufacturers who took the word of some South American student and fulfilled his whims? The inspector asked incredulously. It is incredible, but it is a fact, the specialist said briefly. Why, pray tell, did this Montesi need to dig this shaft? Galbraith still could not take his interlocutor's words at face value. Cold War, the specialist answered just as tersely. He did not want the intelligence services to interfere with his work. Well, yes, the policeman thought, it's so obvious. But still, how did it happen that a project of such a scale remained unknown to the masses? For Galbraith, this was no less a mystery than the fact that he himself had somehow traveled back in time. Adrian Montesi with his charges, continued the silver-haired, in a couple of years created a prototype of a supercomputer. The development was carried out directly underground. Workshops were erected there that assembled microcircuits, memory units, and other components. It sounds like a fragment from some fantastic story, Galbraith couldn't resist. The field of science in which we work will always seem like science fiction to the common man, the Japanese added. Therefore, I will try not to use terms that will not be clear to you in any case, the specialist noted. Thanks for your kind words, the inspector replied sarcastically. The very first program that was recorded in the computer's memory, said the gray-haired man. It was extremely primitive, there was no question of it simulating our world. And now what, is he already simulating? Their guest couldn't help but grin. Don't go getting too far ahead, the specialist said sternly. Galbraith interpreted this remark as a positive answer to his rhetorical question. Curious and curious, he thought. Adrian Montesi eventually achieved his goal, and the computer could function forever and without stopping, the silver-haired man said solemnly. And then he took his secret to the grave, Galbraith joked. Don't blaspheme, Montesi is alive, the specialist exclaimed in fear. Okay, I was joking, the inspector reassured the interlocutor. The inventor was so excited about his success, continued the silver-haired man, that at the end of the test run of the computer, he immediately rushed to the Intellectual Property Office of the United Kingdom and registered the trademark Montech, which was short for Montesi Technologies. Somehow this act does not fit with the way he previously hid his developments from the intelligence services. Galbraith noticed the discrepancy. Idorian Montesher was a very passionate gaijin, the Japanese made an excuse. No one could understand what was going on in his head. Why do you both talk about him in the past tense? Their guest could not help but ask. You should know it, the specialist said. When Montesi registered the trademark, he spoke at an international congress. The only one who was interested in the Chilean's invention was Professor Makoto Shugarami. Galbraith could not help but think that apparently all the other scientists who were at that Congress considered this South American engineer crazy and did not believe his story about an eternal supercomputer. And who would believe? Makoto-san bird a theory. The Japanese began enthusiastically that computer programming is something like human training, when the result showered not be an automatic machine that executes the program embedded in it, but an artificial intelligence that could think and think on its own, without operator intervention. Well, is a strong word. Galbraith involuntarily praised the young interlocutor. Eris, in his homeland Makoto-san had a bad reputation, scientists despised him and cared his thoughts as empty chatter, continued the Asian with a terrible accent. Ha, a typical story about an unrecognized genius, muttered the policeman. And therefore, when the professor read about the creation of Idorian Montessor, he felt that with this gaijin he would be able to re-rise his dream of creating an artificial word. Having said this, the Japanese began to breathe heavily as if in divine awe. There was something strange in this union of a Chilean engineer and a Japanese programmer. But such is the world, two souls found each other, and it was pointlessly for Galbraith to argue with this. Makoto showed Montesi a prototype of his program, which, based on the information entered into it, produced quite meaningful sentences in response. The specialist took over the narrator's initiative. It's like when a baby repeats an adult's actions, his Asian companion explained. Do you want to say that some unknown Japanese professor developed the von Neumann model and achieved success in it? Asked Galbraith. Unknown is a relative concept, the silver-haired man noticed. Do you know who Thomas Kite Sharpless is? How should I know? The policeman did not understand the hint. If you were interested in computers, you would know that this is the chief programmer of electronic numerical integrator and computer, the specialist said in the tone of a mentor. All right, you've got it, Galbraith surrendered. There was silence for a couple of minutes. All three, the inspector, the gray-haired man and the Japanese, continued to descend down the poorly lit spiral staircase, and it seemed that there was no end to this descent. Galbraith was surprised to note that during all this time he was never out of breath. Apparently, the spiral movement put virtually no strain on his legs. Makoto's program delighted Montesi so much. After 3 minutes the silver-haired man continued that he, without thinking twice, appointed a Japanese professor to the post of major programmer of his supercomputer. Makoto-san took with him a staff of his employees, among whom was your humble servant Manabu, the Japanese said with dignity. Within 2 months, the specialist spoke, a team of Japanese programmers worked hard and eventually demonstrated their work to Montesi. Idorian Montessor was so amazed by my teacher's unprecedented results, his Asian companion immediately intervened, that he bowed to his genius and handed over the entire project to him. But where did he go? Galbraith asked a question. Montesi left the Montec, the specialist said, but before leaving, he asked the professor for a favor. What was it? The inspector did not let up. He had 2 requests, continued the silver-haired man. So that they completely forget about it and at the same time change the brand. And what were the successes? The policeman was surprised by these demands of the Chilean. Montec has been re-registered under the new name, Makoto Computerization Institute, the gray-haired man said, a word already familiar to Galbraith. But no one could forget about Idorian Montessor himself. The Japanese inserted the word. Well, of course, Galbraith thought, after all, the fact that this man created technology that can work forever is much more significant than some kind of program. Did he really leave of his own free will? He became suspicious. Makoto-san personally begged Idorian Monteshikuin not to abandon his brainchild, but the gaijin was adamant, as if making excuses, the Asian said. Okay, so what happened next? The inspector ignored this expatiation. When the staff of the institute was headed by Makoto Shugarami, the specialist started talking again. All participants began working on the creation of Makoto's chest. That's what the professor himself called his creation. And what did the programmers put in this chest? Galbraith asked ironically. All kinds of information began to be entered into the supercomputer memory blocks. The silver-haired man began to list. Starting from sciences such as algebra or philosophy and ending with such small things as prices for tickets to Africa or a top list of the best perfumes for young girls. I've never heard so much codswallop, said the inspector. Why fill a supercomputer with all sorts of nonsense? Mikoto-san wanted, the Japanese started, for a computer to have so much information about our world, to build his virtual copy based on it. Galbraith thought that this idea is like the Greek myth of Sisyphus. After all, the world that surrounds people consists of so many little things that collecting this information alone should take decades. But ways of scientists are inscrutable. The inspector even admitted that Professor Mikoto apparently had some health problems that could not allow him to conceive an heir, and so the professor decided to create an electronic child from relays and lines of code. At the moment when this thought occurred to Galbraith, suddenly a bright light hit his eyes. The policeman immediately stopped and involuntarily shielded himself from the light. Well, here is our institute, he heard the solemn voice of the silver-haired man. The inspector's ears heard distant shouts and someone's cheerful negotiations, but he could not make out the words. People were speaking in a language he did not understand. After a few minutes, his eyes, accustomed to the darkness, adapted to the white light of the fluorescent lamps hanging on the ceiling, and gradually Galbraith began to distinguish the interior surrounding him. He and his two companions were now standing in the middle of a long corridor with gleaming metal walls, stretching into the distance and getting lost around a bend. People passed by the three of them, who in the eyes of the policeman were like two peas in a pod, for they were all wearing white coats thrown over their casual clothes. Passers-by glanced at him, but did not stop and moved on. Suddenly Galbraith noticed how one of them slowed down slightly and turned to his helpmeet. Monobuku no Tanari nai te iru konobaka wa daradisu ka, this onlooker said in Japanese. Koregie wadashitachi no gasudada to omomasu, his fellow answered. The young men passed by Galbraith, who continued to stand in one place. He soon realized the reason why everyone was looking at him like that. Apart from the specialist who worked here, the inspector was the only Europoid who, among the crowd of Japanese, looked like an alien from another world. Excuse me, what did these gentlemen say? He turned to Manabu. The scientist looked at the inspector. These two said, Manabu began to translate, that they are very pleased to welcome a distinguished guest to our institute. The mischievous light that burned in the Japanese's eyes made Galbraith doubt the correctness of this translation for a split second, but he did not care whether Manabu correctly conveyed to the foreigner the meaning of his colleague's fleeting remark. Then he suddenly became interested in how such a large number of people could end up underground. By the way, do they live here or, he asked. Only working, the specialist said briefly. And how do they get here? Asked Galbraith. By taxi, the silver-haired man began, but the inspector interrupted him. I mean how they go underground, the policeman specified. It would be strange, he thought, if all these scientists spent more than an hour getting to their workplace. By the elevator, of course, the specialist answered. What, these Japanese don't lose consciousness while they're coming down here? Galbraith recalled the phrase of his interlocutor when he dissuaded him from the elevator. Physicar training, Manabu responded automatically. Somehow these scientists don't look like people involved in sports, Galbraith thought, looking at his interlocutors and at the slender and subtle young men in dressing gowns passing by. Maybe it's just a matter of habit, said the inspector. And that too, nodded the specialist. Suddenly 2 people stopped next to them. Of course, these were also Japanese, but this time they did not limit themselves to just comments in their language, but bowed to Galbraith and extended their hands to him. Hello, the younger one said in fairly good English. Greetings, his senior companion said in a cheerful tone. Apparently they are brothers, the inspector thought, shaking hands first with one, then with the other. These are our new employees, the specialist told him. I hope their names will not be a secret to me, the policeman remarked sarcastically. Of course not, the The silver-haired man seemed not to understand the hint. Get acquainted with Okamura brothers, Shinoda and Ichinos. At these words, the older one chuckled displeasedly, and his younger brother smiled sadly, which somewhat embarrassed Galbraith. I'm glad that there was finally a volunteer willing to test our supercomputer, said Ichinos. I hope the guest will appreciate the fruits of our labors, Shinoda chimed in to his brother. The inspector sighed. He was not satisfied with the fact that these guys talked about him as if for them he was not a person, but some kind of guinea pig. It was not the words themselves, the false wall of feelings, but the intonations of these two. Galbraith prepared for the worst. What do you call this project among yourselves? He asked the brothers. He asked the question not so much out of curiosity, but in order to observe the reaction of these two and assess whether irritation from the excessive importunity of the guest would appear on their faces. We call it Dior, Shinoda replied. Can you tell me how this is deciphered? The inspector did not let up. From the way the Japanese minted the letters, Galbraith guessed that this was an abbreviation. The older brother frowned and, tilting his head to the side, thought for several seconds, as if deciding whether to answer the policeman's question or not. Then his face brightened. DOR is digital-oriented objective replica, he began to answer. The eldest son of the Okamura family pulled out the vowels so much that it seemed to enhance the effect of these words, but in fact only convinced his interlocutor that Shinoda's English was not perfect. Don't listen to him, Ichinos suddenly intervened in the conversation. He is too pedantic and does not see the hidden meaning in the name of our project. Shinoda gave his younger brother a stern look, but he did not notice the reproach. Galbraith couldn't help but admire Ichinos. Still, these Asian brothers were not exact copies of each other, each had their own characteristic feature, which he, a Europoid, was able to discern in each. Shinoda had a decisive fold above his upper lip, which had something masculine about him, while Ichinos, on the contrary, had a kind of childish roundness in his face, not without a peculiar beauty and charm. What they had in common was that they were both almost the same age, and that they both had dark eyes and short hair. And what meaning do you see in this thunderous word? The inspector asked the younger brother. DOR is the door to the future, Ichinos exclaimed with sincere delight. After that, Shinoda leaned over to his brother and began to whisper something angrily in his ear. Apparently, he was reprimanding him for being shockingly inappropriate within the walls of the institute. But Galbraith was much more satisfied with Ichinos's answer. He thought it made much more sense than the cumbersome and abstruse sequence of words that the eldest Okamura brother insisted on. Then the silver-haired man suddenly spoke up, having previously quietly observed the conversation between the guest and the two new employees. Now excuse me, I have to go, things to do, he said calmly. The specialist nodded slightly to the inspector and quickly walked towards the fork in the corridors. A few steps short of the turn, he turned around and waved to Manabu, then disappeared down the left corridor. The Japanese followed the example of his foreign companion and set off after him. Galbraith looked after him for several minutes. The combination of a strict white robe and bare heels looked a little funny. When Manabu disappeared around the bend in the corridor, the inspector again turned his gaze to the brothers and only now noticed that they were also wearing flip-flops. Nothing can be done, he thought, in this underground institute everything is not like normal people. He asked himself an essentially stupid question: do employees change their shoes upon arriving at work, or do they wear slippers in public? Galbraith looked at the eldest of the brothers. He was standing against the wall on which the logo was written, 3 huge red letters MCI. Apparently it was the emblem of the institute. Shinoda moved his lips in concentration and seemed to have forgotten about the guest. Sorry, but what should I do now? The inspector turned to Ichinos, who was twirling a ballpoint pen in his hands out of boredom. Where is your supercomputer, or whatever it's called, Dior? These words brought the older brother out of his trance and he, stopping moving his lips, looked at the inspector. We will now take you where you need to go, the Japanese said somewhat thoughtfully. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us, his younger brother interjected. In this case, Galbraith involuntarily felt inspired. before you take me to the machine, could you arrange an audience for me with Professor Makoto Shugarami? The policeman put all his self-esteem into these words, because he believed that he should not allow others to push him around like a weak-willed animal. After some silence, Shinoda grinned wryly and Galbraith involuntarily felt as if he had exposed himself to ridicule with these words. But it was still better than if the inspector behaved like a weak-willed and naive idiot. Makoto-san left for Tokyo, Shinoda said. On affairs, Galbraith asked out of politeness. The professor decided to pay tribute to his favorite writer. Saying this, Ichinos raised his hands to the ceiling. In what sense? The inspector was surprised by the answer of the younger brother Okamura. Makoto-san honored with his visit winter residence of, and Ichinos pronounced a name unfamiliar to Galbraith, which apparently belonged to some Japanese writer. Okay, that's his business, their guest waved, meaning Professor Makoto. It was bad luck, Galbraith thought, that fate brought him to this institute precisely at the moment when its rector was on vacation. He would have to entrust his life into the hands of these fidgety dunces, in whom the inspector had absolutely no trust. He was already beginning to regret his decision to come here, but a thought suddenly occurred to him. Do you happen to know Dr. Baselard? Galbraith asked both brothers. He asked the question at random, he did not expect to receive a positive answer to it. Actually, that's exactly what happened. No, this is the first time we've heard this name, the Okamura brothers answered in unison. And who is it? Well, he's short, bald, gray-haired and wears glasses. The inspector listed the doctor's characteristics from memory. The brothers shrugged their shoulders, none of them had seen a person with such signs. The inspector lost heart. Ichinos put his hand on his shoulder. Come with us, respected guest, the Japanese said in a soothing tone. The brothers turned at once and headed down the corridor, Galbraith trailing behind them. The three of them walked through narrow passages and countless corridors lined with metal plates that glittered under the white light of the ceiling lamps. Occasionally there were niches in the walls in which gas cylinders and batteries were located. Sometimes the walls were crossed by long pipes, from which a faint hum emanated. Apparently it was a heating pipeline. But the inspector had nothing to do with the architectural delights and technical subtleties of this institute. His thoughts were occupied with completely different problems. He walked quickly behind the Okamura brothers, trying not to lag behind them even a step, and thought that if it weren't for these two, he would probably have gotten lost in these monotonous metal guts of tunnels, each of which seemed to have at least 1,000 passages and branches. Finally the brothers stopped in a small nook. The inspector stood behind them and watched as Ichinos winked at him and, facing the corrugated iron door, leaned on the handle with visible effort. She didn't give in. A grin crossed Galbraith's face for a second. Shinoda glanced at his younger brother with a frown. Move away, Ototo, Shinoda said and lightly pushed Ichinos. He jumped away from the door in fear and, hunching his shoulders, pressed himself against the wall. The older brother immediately grabbed the handle and pulled it towards himself. The massive door swung open so sharply that Shinoda almost lost his balance and only managed to stay on his feet by grabbing the door frame. His guest grinned again, but when the Japanese turned to him, the inspector immediately fell silent and, just in case, took a step back, as if fearing that his smile could cause displeasure in his interlocutor. For a second, Galbraith and Shinoda looked into each other's eyes, then the second turned his gaze to his younger brother, who had already come to his senses, and grinned. Then it's up to you, Shinoda said cheerfully. Are you talking to me? Galbraith did not understand to whom the phrase was addressed. Of course, the older brother Okamura again turned his gaze to the inspector. There was interest in the Japanese's eyes, about the same as that of a scientist observing the behavior of a laboratory rat. I don't like this look, Galbraith thought, but did not argue and stepped over the threshold. Once he was inside, he heard the door behind him begin to slowly close. The policeman turned around with lightning speed and leaned on the heavy door with both hands. Behave yourself, Baka, Shinoda muttered displeasedly. The inspector had to obey, and when the door slammed shut, he looked around suspiciously. It was dark, the only source of light in the room was a red light bulb that flickered dimly on the ceiling. Galbraith hesitantly took a couple of steps into the darkness, when suddenly a loud click reached his ears, and the room was illuminated by the bright light of the same fluorescent lamps that were in the corridor. "Now, listen up, guest," came a booming voice, followed by a hiss of static. The policeman turned his head in the direction where the source of the sound was coming from. The voice came from a speaker hanging directly above the door. "Go ahead, guest, and do what I tell you," said the invisible announcer. The inspector shrugged and turned on his heel. What opened before his eyes was a room with a low ceiling, covered with the same iron plates as the rest of the interior of the underground institute. Galbraith moved forward. He saw a dashboard mounted into the wall, next to which stood what looked like a chair, which the policeman could tell was made of chromed metal. Its back curved slightly back, and the seat and armrests were upholstered in what looked like faux leather. Galbraith involuntarily shuddered when he saw this. He immediately associated this design with the electric chair, in which executions were still carried out in some states of America. It was strange to see such a thing in an English computer institute run by the Japanese, but he was not laughing at the moment. "So, you see the spectator's seat," the distorted voice rang out again. "Huh, a very pretty name for this structure," Galbraith thought sarcastically. He walked up to the chair and touched his finger to the upholstery. It turns out that the chair was upholstered in rubber. "So as not to accidentally give me an electric shock," he thought. "Get into it and press the red button, which is on your left," the announcer's voice gave the command. Galbraith was in no hurry to sit in this chair. The thought occurred to him whether this was part of Dr. Baselard's plan, the essence of which was to lure the inspector underground, and then put him in the electric chair, and that's it, the unwanted person was eliminated. The policeman decided to turn to the invisible owner of this impudent voice. He didn't expect anyone to answer him or even just hear him, but it was still worth a try. "Hey, what is your name?" Galbraith shouted, turning his head around. "What?" a voice boomed questioningly. "Why is this chair?" asked the inspector. In order to connect to the thoughts of Dor, the announcer answered loudly. "I don't understand where the logic is here," the policeman shouted. "You sit in the spectator's seat, and at the press of a button a special adapter will be connected to your head, allowing you to read the dreams of a supercomputer," the voice explained loudly. "Why is everything so difficult?" Galbraith exclaimed almost capriciously. "Nothing complicated," the invisible announcer seemed to smile. "You just sit down and connect." "Is it really true that you didn't find a single person in your entire institute who could simply mount a screen?" asked Galbraith. "DOR provides information in the form of a sequence of pulses. We are actively working to ensure that a supercomputer can convert it into a continuous stream of video signal, but at this stage all tasks associated with visualization are performed by the brain of the spectator. Much like with a book, it's just a set of letters, but in your head they are transformed into vivid images." After this tirade, the voice died down. Due to the static and echo of the room, it was impossible to understand who this voice actually belonged to, but when Galbraith heard this analogy from the lips of an invisible operator, the inspector immediately thought that the person sitting at the microphone was none other than a gray-haired specialist. However, the policeman did not enter into an altercation with him. What was the point if he was still locked in a room similar to a prison cell? "Sit in the seat," the voice rang out again. "Well," thought Galbraith, "you pushed it enough." He straightened his jacket and settled into his chair. "Now push the button," the announcer continued. "And I will get the result," thought the inspector. Galbraith turned his head to the left and saw, right next to the armrest, a small recess in the dashboard, in the depths of which a blue light flickered. He leaned closer. Upon closer inspection, it was revealed that it was a round plastic button with a barely noticeable bulge in the middle. "No, wait," the policeman raised his head up. "What questions?" a voice boomed from the speaker. "Would you describe in general terms what I will see in these dreams?" Galbraith shouted as if fighting for his life. "Okay," the announcer muttered, as if doing him a favor. Professor Makoto Shugarami did not intend to create a specific personality of the machine mind, he simply downloaded information into it. However, when we did the first reading, we noticed that the supercomputer in its thoughts considers itself a young American mafioso who lives in a European town. This electronic brain has an unbridled imagination, thought Galbraith. And what is the name of this e-mafia of yours? Asked the inspector. Edwin DeForest, the voice answered dryly. All right, gentlemen, I'm ready, the policeman finally agreed. Galbraith looked away from the shiny metal ceiling and looked again at the blue light. He hesitated a little, almost like when he first boarded his first plane. Then the fact was that he was leaving his native England in order to get to the unknown Dostjalobd land. And now, what an irony of fate. He did return trip, in order to get into the thoughts of some electronic brains in the depths of a suspicious underground bunker. Galbraith wiped the sweat on his forehead with his hand and, thinking tenderly about poor little Delia, resolutely extended his hand to the button. There was a barely audible click, and on the ceiling, right above Galbraith's head, a small panel opened slightly, from where a manipulator, ending in 3 silver claws, extended downwards. With the sound of servos, they began to slowly approach the head of the inspector, who involuntarily shivered in his chair. Relax, guest, came a voice, and close your eyes. The policeman closed his eyes. He felt the manipulator's 3 fingers wrap around the back and sides of his head. Galbraith was not in pain, but the feeling was not pleasant. It seemed that his head was being squeezed in a vice, which was not far from the truth. Stop thinking, said the announcer. The inspector opened his eyes when he heard this. He wanted to ask how he should understand this request, but was horrified to discover that his tongue had stopped obeying him. Apparently, some kind of paralyzing impulse had been sent through the manipulator rods. But fortunately for him, the invisible operator seemed to understand that the guest was demanding an explanation. This is necessary for, the voice began to explain, so that the flow of your thoughts does not interrupt the flow of information of electronic consciousness, because otherwise you risk not seeing anything. And yes, the announcer remarked sternly, close your eyes, I asked you. Galbraith thought that this was similar to how cinema advertisements encourage viewers not to wonder, but to simply watch what is shown on the screens. He closed his eyes as tightly as possible, simultaneously noticing that the room was drowned in darkness. An hour passed, and the room was filled with fluorescent light again. The inspector felt someone's hands begin to remove the metal claws of the manipulator from his head. He hardly opened his eyes. Both Okamura brothers were standing next to him. Shinoda freed Galbraith's head from the embrace of the car, then nodded to Ichino's, and they helped the inspector get out of his chair. Tired, Shinoda politely asked the guest. I'm fine, he wheezed. Thanks for taking care of me. The policeman's legs could hardly support him, his whole body was so exhausted, as if he had run a cross-country race for several miles. If it weren't for these 2 Japanese, Galbraith would inevitably fall to the floor. The brothers grabbed the inspector under the arms and all 3 headed towards the exit. The guest raised his head, right on the threshold of which stood a specialist who looked at him with a smile. Can we go through? Shinoda turned to him. Yes, of course, and the silver-haired man stepped aside. When they found themselves in the corridor, the Japanese released Galbraith, and he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Impressions from the computer dream reading session filled his head. The inspector stood there for several minutes, then straightened his jacket and looked at the specialist and the Okamura brothers standing nearby. They seemed to be eagerly waiting for him to share with them his thoughts on their invention. Well, gentlemen, Galbraith said slowly, it was great, I'll tell you. How would you describe what you saw? Shinoda asked automatically. Ichino's face shone with happiness. He, as Galbraith understood, was very pleased to hear praise for the work to which he had a hand. It can be compared to an action-packed movie, the policeman honestly admitted. That is an interesting point, the specialist exclaimed and raised his finger up. What? Galbraith stared at the silver-haired man. If Adrian Montesi had not dropped out of the institute, he would not have failed to take advantage of your idea, his interlocutor explained. Why do you think so? The inspector did not understand these words. So that you know, continued the silver-haired, Montesi dreamed of directing movie pictures as a child, but his parents wanted to raise an engineer, so he reluctantly had to go against his desires. Curious, the inspector scratched his mustache. I believe that Montesi still has the thought in his head that he should not have obeyed the will of his parents, said the specialist. Galbraith lost in thought. Because this explains why he so easily transferred his project into the hands of the Japanese professor, the silver-haired man finished his speech. Yes, Galbraith thought, people are funny. The genius, the inventor of the eternal supercomputer, had such a trivial complex that ultimately forced its owner to renounce the invention. The policeman looked at the Okamura brothers. They stood silently and lowered their eyes. So, you think, the inspector turned to the silver-haired man, what this supercomputer of yours be used to create movies? Pourquoi pas, the specialist exclaimed again in French. It would be nice if we taught DOR display his dreams on celluloid tape in the form of a series of images, then we will give this material to some film studio, which will record the voice acting and edit the film. Ichino's Okamura joined the joke. Young Japanese assistant said that their tape will be gladly accepted by some American studio, who is trying to save every cent on making its motion pictures, then they always successfully foxed its viewers. I am sure that the film, shot by a supercomputer, will break records at many international film festivals, the silver-haired man continued with a crazy gleam in his eyes. And when critics appreciate the film, it is possible that it will even be shown on cable television, Shinoda said. Gentlemen, do you honestly believe this? Galbraith couldn't believe his ears. No, we're just joking, the specialist immediately took on a serious expression. Galbraith could not help but admit that these scientists had a good sense of humor. And the way they phrased their jokes only reinforced his opinion of how ahead of its time their invention was. A certain DOR that will bury the movie industry, he thought. It is clear that the last word will not belong to the supercomputer itself, but to the audience, but the media love to dramatize events. Thinking about the film industry, an idea came to Galbraith's head. What if it suddenly happened that this entire adventure that he had experienced was suddenly decided to be filmed? Standing in the metal corridor of the Underground Institute, the inspector began to turn over in his head what transformations his ill-fated story could undergo if it fell into the trembling with impatience hands of filmmakers, as he was sure, these would definitely be the guys from Hollywood. Obviously, the main location from the not very famous city of Portland would be moved to New York. For some reason these hard workers from Los Angeles really liked this long-suffering city. England would have been completely removed from the plot because the producer would have decided to save money on filming in London. Surely they would not be too lazy to cast Belmondo for the role of Galbraith himself. After all, this actor could work miracles, and even the most ordinary characters in his performance came to life and acquired a depth unprecedented on paper. The inspector wondered how critics would react to the participation of a French actor in an American film. Then Galbraith thought about Delia. Her story on the screen definitely could not have happened without cuts, censorship and rethinking. The inspector immediately imagined how, through the efforts of American screenwriters, the modest little girl Delia would turn into some stern and gloomy boy or, even better, a twitchy teenager with complexes named Delian, in no case Dalian, so that the audience would not confuse this film with a not yet released fifth of the ridiculous, in his humble opinion, adventures of some devilish boy. The inspector had not seen any of the films in the well-known franchise, the fourth installment of which had been shown on cable television 6 months ago, for if exclude his time travel in a taxicab. But he remembered the rumors among popcorn movie fans that in the extreme part, this naughty boy, for no apparent reason, acquired a sister just as nasty and ridiculous as he himself. Or maybe it was the other way around, and that boy had no sister, and the girl could have been his daughter, who looked like 2 peas in a pod like her young father. Thinking about the kinship of characters in stupid movies, the inspector caught himself thinking that he was beginning to hate the entire American cinema in general and that franchise in particular. The fact that Hollywood filmmakers would decide to replace Delia with a boy in the film adaptation of his adventures, Galbraith explained to himself by the fact that the death of a little girl, even if she was left behind the scenes, would cause a flurry of indignant letters from women with offended maternal feelings, which any studio, of course, would never allow and would try to avoid by any means necessary. But changing the gender of the central character could happen if the filmmakers decided to keep the plot of the film, in which the hero, who, as Galbraith thought, would definitely be played by Belmondo, must begin an investigation into the murder of a child. If these scoundrel filmmakers decide that the film should become a melodrama, and what, there will be savings on special effects, plus there will be no need to strain with a child actor, then the role of Delia will be given to some middle-aged, but well-preserved actress, and the entire plot will be rewritten in the standard Hollywood way, which involves an obligatory, albeit completely unjustified, love scene between the hero and heroine, usually ending in shading in the first 10 frames. Then the whole plot will be redone beyond recognition, reducing the story to a banal detective story, where the entire timing of Dr. Baselard, a young and handsome gynecologist, or better yet, a simple dentist, will play the role of another suspect, who in the denouement Belmondo will pathetically kill with a couple of shots from a police colt. And there won't even be any talk about Delia's death from cancer, more precisely, from an attempt to cure her of a disease very similar to it. The character played by an adult actress will live until the very end and in the final frames will connect her lips with Belmondo's lips, and these two will kiss to a mawkish melody played by a symphony orchestra. After all, the fashion for synthesizer music for films remained in the 80s. With the change in Delia's age, the problem with trying to adapt Jordan Thurlow for the screen is immediately removed, because this very ambiguous character with a questionable moral character is too subtle so that his story does not cause rejection from the audience at best, and at worst, sharp criticism of the director, whom they will begin to accuse him of allegedly indulging pedophiles, even though in reality this is far from the case. Well, or, Galbraith thought, Joe will also be changed gender, and some fool will appear in the plot who will fight with adult Delia for the heart of the attractive protagonist and cast languid glances at him with a strange smile. Although no, the inspector decided, the filmmakers would take an easier path and Mr. or Mrs. Thurlow would simply disappear from the plot, because the extra plot emphasis in the film would be completely meaningless. Why spend a long and tedious time showing on the screen an idiot who hates the main character, if you can just limit yourself to a short phrase from Belmondo, by which viewers will understand that his hero had in the past a fleeting relationship with the daughter of some journalist, and the appearance of Delia in his life awakened in him a long-extinguished interest in women. Such a detail will appeal to lonely bachelors over 40 who are going to cinema in order to associate oneself with a courageous protagonist who, with the snap of a finger, puts the entire female cast of the film at his feet. Now you can go home, the specialist's voice suddenly rang out. The inspector flinched when the white-haired man placed a hand on his shoulder, which pulled him away from his thoughts regarding the potential film adaptation of his adventures. Well, finally, Galbraith grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. I've already decided that I'm going to hang around here until the end of my days. And the four of them headed forward, the silver-haired one in front, the Okamura brothers behind him, and at the very end Galbraith himself. He again had to trudge for a long time along the narrow metal corridors of the Underground Institute, every now and then giving way to random employees who came across him on the way. It seemed that the penetration of the computer into the dreams affected the inspector like a psychotherapy session. Now he was no longer worried about claustrophobia, and he felt free and confident. Finally they stopped in the hall, where at that time there was no one. The silver-haired man walked forward and pressed the elevator call button. What, now you'll let me go up like normal? Galbraith still remembered the silver-haired man's phrase about elevators. Now there is no need to go up the spiral staircase, the specialist answered without noticing the reproach. We called a taxi for you, Shinoda addressed the guest. When you reach the surface of the earth, you will have to wait a little for the car because the institute is far from the city, Ichinos warned. Well, thank you, Galbraith hesitated slightly. Friends, and he shook hands with both brothers. Yes, by the way, the silver-haired man who was standing at the elevator raised his finger again. Indoors, we hung the fur coat on a hanger in advance. What are you talking about? The inspector did not understand. It's winter outside, and you're dressed lightly. The specialist looked at Galbraith with warmth that was atypical for such an elderly man. Okay, the policeman nodded slightly. The massive elevator doors slowly opened, and Galbraith's heart suddenly sank. It seemed to him that his entire future fate would depend on this trip. Taking one last look at the gray-haired man and the Okamura brothers, he stepped into the open doorway, and the doors closed behind him. The inspector had been waiting for the moment when he would leave this institute for so long, but now, when he was riding in the elevator, he felt uneasy because everything that was happening was like some kind of strange dream. In addition, he felt an almost superstitious fear that the elevator might get stuck between floors. But soon the elevator car stopped moving, and when the doors opened, Galbraith went out into the same room where the specialist and Manabu met him. After walking a few steps, the policeman noticed that there was no longer a single white coat on the hanger, but the fur coat that the gray-haired man had promised was hanging, which Galbraith immediately put on. The clothes fit him just right, except that the sleeves were a little short. I wonder, he thought, who owned this fur coat, the gray-haired man or one of these Japanese? In any case, this did not bother the inspector much, who, having passed through the double wooden doors, found himself on the street. It was night, the snow was falling incessantly. The inspector shivered and raised his head up. Inhaling the cold air, Galbraith came to his senses and, looking around, saw the lights of an approaching car ahead of him. There could be no doubt the Japanese kept their promise. Galbraith, unexpectedly for himself, suddenly felt such a surge of strength that he wanted to sing, and he, slowly stepping forward, began to go over in his mind the songs that had sunk into his soul. He remembered how, back in Portland, he had seen a German film in a bootleg theater, the end credits of which played a song that he remembered then because it was in English. Putting his hands in the pockets of his fur coat, Galbraith began to hum her words. Lonely presence, damaged the work, you can't, he stumbled. Everything the God. The inspector very quickly abandoned this matter, realizing that he did not remember the exact words of this song. But he was aware of that it was sung about a man who played Lord God, tried to build a new world. Be that as it may, melody of this song, which, as the inspector remembered, was played on the piano, remained forever in his memory. So Galbraith gave up trying to sing the song and just played it in his head, watching the car lights approach. Absolute void. Asia Vairia, I love you.